Hey guys, welcome to my channel, The Airsoft Tech. On this episode of 5-Minute Tech Tips, we're going to be going over managing piston resistance. So as an Airsoft Tech, whether you're a beginner, intermediate tech, or even an expert tech, you should have one phrase bouncing back and forth in your mind, and that phrase should be resistance is futile. You should be trying to get rid of as much resistance as possible inside the gearbox and everywhere else in the gun that you can, because we all know that resistance leads to heat. And heat leads to lost energy, and this energy could be making our BB gats firing much more efficiently. So today we're going to be going over piston resistance, whether it's piston resistance in the gearbox shell on the rails, or piston resistance in the cylinder between the piston head, O-ring, and cylinder. Today we'll be taking a look at how to manage all that and make your gun as efficient as possible. So when we talk about piston resistance, we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about piston resistance on the rails, so between the gearbox shell the other gearbox shell and the piston, you can have resistance. So your piston can be super tight, or it can be so loose that it's actually falling off the rails sometimes. Oftentimes, if there's an issue, it's going to be where it's too tight. So we'll be talking about how to manage that. And the other type of resistance is between your cylinder and your piston. Well, more likely your piston head and your O-ring. So for example, this piston slides in and out super easily, almost no resistance at all. However, sometimes you have O-rings that are so enlarged, and sometimes even piston heads that are so large that they actually will not cycle back and forth throughout the cylinder without a lot of force. So when you have these systems of stress and added resistance in your system, what you're doing is you're creating, obviously, resistance. This resistance makes your motor work harder, which makes your motor pull more energy from your battery. All of this leads to a less efficient gun. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about how we manage this stress here. So the very first thing we want to do is actually test and see if you have this resistance. So what you do is take a piston and your piston head assembly, and you take your gearbox shell, set it to like this, screw it down, and you test by pull, like setting your gearbox shell like this, and then setting it like this. And if your piston can go back and forth with little to no resistance, then you're just good to go. You have no or optimal piston resistance. If you do have resistance, however, what you can do, and it's really quite easy, is you can take a Dremel, a file, or some sandpaper. I highly recommend a Dremel because I'm a fan of speed and I hate things that are very slow. Anyway, what you do is you take your Dremel and you go across the piston rails and shave them down a little bit. Do the same thing on both sides. Do this and test it back and forth, and make sure, taking off a little bit at a time, because you can always take away more, you can't really add on in this case, and testing each time. So I would take away some material on both sides, about an even amount on both sides, and then screw the gearbox shell back together and test again. I find that this works every single time when you do have piston resistance. When you have piston resistance, it's one of two culprits. It's because these piston rails here are slightly too close together, or this right here, this rail, is a little too thick. So what tends to happen is it kind of chokes on these piston rails. And so what you can do is you can take your Dremel and widen those rails, the space between the rails, and that'll fix the problem. Or the other problem is that the rails are just too long. They protrude too much from the piston body. And when they protrude too much from the piston body, they kind of jam themselves into these spaces here, and that also creates resistance. So what you can do is you just shave across here, and you test, you take some away, you test it, and if it's not good enough, you take some more away until it is good enough. And that's one form of piston resistance. You could get a problem where the piston body itself right here is like jammed up against the gearbox shell, or it's jammed too low. If that is the case, then, which I have never ever seen in my 6 years of teching, you can take away from the top of the body or from the lower portion of the body, whichever one is necessary. However, if that's the case, you're looking at potentially having a messed up gearbox shell that's quite severely messed up, or a severely messed up piston from out of the factory as a result of how it's manufactured. Like I said, I've never seen resistance that comes from that source, but that's not to say it could never happen. Another form of resistance is resistance between the piston and piston head and the cylinder. So for example, if I were to put my piston and piston head and everything in here, and I have it set like this whole apparatus, and I let go, and the piston doesn't come out just fine due to gravity, then I have too much resistance between the cylinder and the piston head. Now, this resistance could be as a result of the piston head being too large, or the O-ring being just enlarged itself. So it's one of the two. It could be both at the same time, but it's more likely going to be just one. I've never seen it to where it's a cylinder problem. I've always seen it to where it's a piston or piston O-ring problem. So it's highly unlikely that it's your actual cylinder that's causing the issue, though I would never put it out of the realm of possibilities when it comes down to airsoft. If it's your piston, what you can do is you should make sure it's your piston first by actually checking. In this case, it's definitely not a piston problem. But if it is your piston, what you can do is you can take this piston and you can mount it into an electric drill. And you can take some sandpaper or a file and you can wrap it or put a little bit of that sandpaper against the piston head and then turn on that drill, and so it'll take away material all the way around the piston head evenly. Do this for 10-15 second cycles and test it each time until that fixes your problem, of course. Now if it's your O-ring that's the problem, I would recommend just buying a new O-ring instead of actually trying to modify this O-ring, which would be ridiculous. You just might as well buy a new one, because O-rings are dirt cheap. You can buy a packet of like 10 or 15 of them for around $2 to $3, and you'll definitely use them if you're going to continue doing tech work. But at the end of the day, what your result should look like is something like this, where the piston and piston head and O-ring just kind of slide on out of the cylinder. As you can see, I get perfect compression. Absolutely no issues with compression at all, yet there's no resistance between my piston head and cylinder. So there it is, another episode of 5-minute tech tips. Well, I hope you guys found those tips enjoyable and enlightening. I'll see you guys on the next episode of 5-minute tech tips.